The Last of Us is one of those games that comes up anytime anyone wants to talk about narrative in video games. Because as far as story-driven games go, it's nearly flawless. From voice acting and animation to writing, cinematography, and gameplay pacing, there's no weak link here. But this has all been said before, and so much so that I even think it's done a bit of a disservice to the game. Don't mistake me, every bit of praise the game received for its story is deserved. To my mind, the issue lies in the praise that it never received. Because no one thinks to bring up The Last of Us in conversations about multiplayer shooters. In fact, the only response more common than people thinking the game didn't need one is people who didn't even know it had one. I understand the sentiment and skepticism. Naughty Dog pushed this game as a story-focused experience, and the time and money spent developing a multiplayer could infringe on the devs' ability to deliver the experience they wanted to. On top of that, multiplayer shooters have a tendency to employ mechanics that conflict with the themes that drive this story. It's an understandable worry that the inclusion of such a mode diminishes what the game is supposed to be about, and story-based shooters have had a bad precedent for tacked-on multiplayers. With that said, I can't help but feel like this multiplayer never got the fair shake it deserved, and I'm hoping to rectify that here. Because to date, this remains my favorite competitive shooter experience nearly of all time. When you begin playing, you're given a choice between two factions from the story, Hunter or Firefly. This doesn't actually affect the game, just the characters and voices you see and hear during play. Matches are even set in approximations of the areas from the story, giving you a sense that these conflicts are just another part of the wider world that Joel and Ellie inhabit. This isn't to say, however, that it's good because it has a Last of Us skin on it. I haven't played anything like this multiplayer before or since. There's a lot that's become synonymous with this genre of game, but by leaning on the things that make The Last of Us unique, it recontextualizes, repurposes, and rejects many mechanics to create an experience that's distinctly The Last of Us. Okay, so the obvious example can be found by watching how the player characters move. Both in single and multiplayer, they move slow, but not sluggish. The controls are tightly tuned and polished to give Dark Souls a run for its money, but the smallest actions still require the player consider and commit to them. Whether it's reviving allies to healing yourself or reloading, listening for and crawling from enemies, sprinting, vaulting, crafting, punching, stabbing, exploding, burning, shooting, it's a violent game. Some actions have even more tells, such as a gleam on a weapon, sound cue, or an uninterruptible animation that allow your opponents to anticipate and react to your actions. You can't very well take cover from fire when you're busy ripping blades out of someone's neck. Now, these timings interact beautifully with the game's cover system, which benefit for not including any snap-to controls. All of this coming together to create seriously tense choices in the moment-to-moment gameplay, such as whether or not to chase down a damaged enemy or heal an ally. When compared to many other shooters that follow a simple gameplay loop of move, shoot, die, repeat, there's a greater sense of forethought and consequence that pervades throughout every action the player takes, made even more impactful due to the scarcity and resources available to the players and the amount of players themselves. Matches are no larger than 4 to a team, meaning a single player is given a much greater impact over the game. There's a tension to be had in an encounter with a single enemy that's often absent in larger player count games. The difficulty in facing down multiple enemies only makes prevailing that much more rewarding. Incidentally, the small game size also offer players the opportunity to find friends and rivals much easier through emergent gameplay than the absolute chaos of a 32+ player firefight. Nothing quite bonds you to a stranger like having your life saved and saving theirs in turn. Conflicts funnel around supply boxes, which drop crafting items, ammo, and health, while also serving as an in-game comeback mechanic, affording these supplies more generously to the losing team. They're situated in areas with ample cover and multiple means of approach, creating an inevitability to firefights. By making players literally fight over supplies, the game is thematically reinforcing that they are first and foremost scavengers. When the players take damage, instead of just dying, the gameplay again changes drastically. The player goes down, and if they can avoid taking additional damage or being approached, they can crawl to an ally to be revived. If they die, then they respawn while depleting a reinforcement ticket. The team that loses all of its reinforcement tickets first loses. There's a small but interesting dynamic at play here. Despite it being a traditional deathmatch setup, players are fighting to out-attrition their opponents. In many cases, it can be more impactful to keep yourself alive than to chase down a kill. If a downed player is approached by an enemy, then that enemy can perform an execution, playing out a brutal finishing animation that leaves the executioner vulnerable, but grants them additional parts, the in-game currency that they can use to buy weapon upgrades, armor, and, crucially, ammo. Because weapons don't come stocked with reservoirs of bullets, hell, some don't even begin with a full magazine. If you start to run low, which should happen pretty quickly, then you'll need to loot the bodies of enemies you've killed or make your way to supply boxes. Clever play and a disciplined trigger finger should ensure you never lack ammo when you need it, but make no mistake, the outcome of every shot, hit or miss, is consequential. The ammo economy is one of the most fundamental changes to the formula. It organically pushes players into further conflict by forcing them to move through the level like the scavengers they're supposed to be. When you compare the gameplay to nearly any other shooter, the differences are night and day. This scarcity doesn't just affect the guns though. Crafted explosives stand in for most games' traditional grenades, keeping the basic gameplay loop focused on the gunplay. If a player wants one, they'll have to find the components, keep themselves safe while they craft it, and then choose their moment carefully. But because players don't begin with one out of the gates, and even throwing them is telegraphed quite heavily, they can afford to be made incredibly dangerous, often capable of swinging entire matches. The player will have to consider the items they won't be able to craft, however. Bombs, molotovs, shivs, smokescreens, melee upgrades, and health kits all rely on the same pool of components and have varying degrees of risk and reward to them that alter the ways the player can approach combat. Finally, there's the game's loadout system. It's nothing special in concept, but it's another axis by which the scarcity that's so present is reinforced. The player uses the same pool of loadout points to select skills and weapons, keeping the power budget in check while allowing the player to focus on and highlight any aspect of the gameplay they want. Every skill and weapon fills its own niche with very little overlap. The ability to mix and match lets players create a loadout and playstyle that really is their own. Even catering to archetypal playstyles feels like you're making your own way to play, and effectively delivering on that marketing headline has got to be one of the biggest challenges a multiplayer developer can face, and Naughty Dog succeeded with flying colors. Mostly grays and lots of reds. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about at least a single flaw after so much praise. After all, every game has them. Few of its flaws are unique to The Last of Us's formula though, thus in many ways it's unfair to hold it to such a high standard. However, I sincerely believe that, had they been given more time to address it, Naughty Dog would have been the developer to find some answers. The most long-standing factor that affects game after game is how respawning is handled. Players spawn on a fixed wave timer at random points and levels, meaning they can easily fall victim to poor spawn placements and death chaining, leading matches into a one-sided snowball. This is often accentuated by the level design that allows players to be caged in and picked off, which, being clear, isn't a flaw within the levels themselves, which are immaculately crafted, even while constrained to using boxy, inorganic shapes. Rather, the problem arises because of the simplicity of spawning on a fixed wave timer when the value of a single life is so high. This is a problem that shooters have struggled with for a long time, and I've yet to see a flawless solution implemented into any game. There's one egregiously imbalanced weapon in the game, and this wouldn't be noteworthy if it wasn't paid DLC. Being fair, the weapon is not more than $1 and was released in 2014, 2 years give or take after the game's launch. It was also included in preset loadouts so that players could try them out before they decided whether or not to purchase them. It's far from exploitatively pay to win, and at the time I was happy to toss a bit of money at the devs for a little more content, but the concept is still disconcerting. Given how far into its life cycle this game is, it's no surprise that there are some seriously skilled players out there, with access to the entire pool of content. You've got an uphill battle if you want to break into the game now. Progression-based unlocks are a common shorthand for player retention, but they don't often facilitate fair gameplay. Combine this with tightly tuned mechanics ripe for a few animation exploits and a small devoted community, and you have a game that allows entrenched players to repeatedly stomp on anyone who tries to approach it at this point. Which might make the esports crowd happy, or it would if they were able to get over using the controller. Now, the last thing that can qualify as a flaw really isn't, but it's regarding how little content is there. Considering the full experience, story and multiplayer, it's genuinely baffling that they were even able to accomplish what they did here. Nothing will keep a game from getting stale eventually, but once you've exhausted your personal thirst for the competitive, there's no cooperative horde mode or neutral infected mobs that switch gameplay up. not even a real player avatar customization. Now, just to reiterate, this can't rightly be considered a flaw, because at some point in development, a decision was made to omit these features. They have been implemented in Naughty Dog's past titles after all. Still, the gameplay only has one scenario on offer, and it boils down to some variation of
down.
yeah. And if that stops being fun, or never was your cup of tea to begin with, then there really isn't anything else here. A competitive multiplayer for The Last of Us should have been an inherent contradiction. And yet, it managed to both be the best multiplayer shooter I've ever played, and at times outshine the single player in delivering on the stress and violence of a post-apocalypse. Despite years of new multiplayer releases, The Last of Us's community has remained stable. Yet nothing kills a game like a sequel. With the growing hype for The Last of Us Part 2, I just wanted to make sure that my favorite piece of this game wasn't forgotten, and I can't wait to see what comes next. Thanks for watching.